Hi everyone. In this video, I'll be going over the first chapter of the Brain Facts book. More specifically, I'll be going over a few of the most important parts in chapter 1. I'll keep continuing videos. I'll make a video almost per paragraph because there's a lot of information to decode in the book. And if you don't read it carefully enough, you may not get the right information. So that's why I'm going to make an in-depth series explaining the chapters in elaboration. So in this video, we're going to be going over the major brain landmarks. So let's start very generalized, right? First is the three main parts that I'm sure everybody's heard of: the cerebrum, cerebellum, and the brainstem. So let's start off with the cerebrum. So that's the biggest part of the brain, and it's classified by cortical regions and subcortical regions. So let me rephrase that. On the cerebrum, you know that the brain is extremely wrinkly, right? So there's actually names for that. The bumps on the brain are known as gyri, and the indents that separate the hills or mountains, as people like to call them, are called sulci. So gyri and sulci, which are very important to identifying the parts of the brain, right? So these gyri and sulci form the topmost layer of the cerebrum, called the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is responsible for a lot of higher order thinking, such as planning, personality, and so on and so forth. Underneath the cerebral cortex are some subcortical regions, right? Or regions that are under the cortical or top layer, right? So those structures are more so for maintaining the brute force of the body. In other words, they maintain homeostasis, they are emotions, they are survival, and we'll get more into that later on. So that's the cerebrum. It's split into two hemispheres, the right and the left hemispheres, which are symmetrical. Then comes the cerebellum. The cerebellum is a part of the brain that is most associated with fine motor skills. In other words, if you were to go for balance, or say you have to time throwing a dart precisely, that would mostly be mediated by the cerebellum in terms of timing and balance. Additionally, say you're trying to learn how to ride a bicycle, right? When that's not its type of memory, which is called non-declarative memory, which we'll get later on into this series, which is basically that it does not depend on the cortex to store it. So, for example, tying your shoelace, that's almost motor memory, right? Typing, you memorize the motion. You won't really forget that in the same way that, say, if you have dementia, you won't forget those things because the cerebellum stores those things, then the cerebellum mediates those things rather than the cerebrum, which is more targeted in neurodegenerative disorders. Then there's the brainstem, which is quite literally maintaining the very basic functions of life, right? Like breathing and posture and heartbeat, which is something the brainstem maintains. So, in other words, autonomic functions. Now let's get into the cortical regions. So we remember how we said this topmost layer of the cerebrum is known as the cerebral cortex. Well, let's split it down a little bit, right? So there are four regions of the cerebral cortex, which are known as the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. So there's two of them in the entire brain. So per hemisphere, there's one of these sections, right? So let's get more into detail. The frontal lobe is the frontmost part of the cerebral cortex. So in that, let's go over some brief anatomy, right? So here we can see the superior frontal gyrus, the middle frontal gyrus, the inferior frontal gyrus, and the motor cortex, also known as the precentral gyrus. So the superior frontal gyrus is responsible for a phenomenon known as working memory. So when you're reading a phone number, right, or when you're trying to memorize a phone number, this type of memory works by only remembering that piece of information while you're using it. For example, say I am reading off of a script. If I'm reading off of a script, I'm only going to remember parts of the script. And if I've just read it, I'm only going to remember those parts of the script while I'm remembering or while I'm explicitly using the script. Or another example would be when I'm trying to memorize a phone number. I'll only remember the phone number until I'm using it. And once I'm done using it, I'll forget it because I didn't memorize, I didn't interact with that as much. The middle frontal gyrus is used for literacy and numeracy. So let me explain that a little bit more. So in the brain, in general, the left side of the brain is associated with stronger parts of speaking and reading, etc. Now, this doesn't mean that only the left side works on speech or only the left side works on literacy types. Both the right and the left work on literacy, but the left side has been more active in people when literacy things have been activated, right? So on the right middle frontal gyrus, that's associated with numeracy. So computing sums, etc. That's more of the middle frontal gyrus. And literacy is the left side. So fluency of speaking, so on and so forth, is more so the middle frontal gyrus. But and then there's the inferior frontal gyrus, which is also associated with speech very strongly. In this, it's separated into three parts: pars orbitalis, triangularis, and opercularis, which are basically a few selections. Pars opercularis is very special because it marks the area of Broca's area. Broca's area is a very revolutionary spot in the brain in the sense that it controls motor speech. So what it does is it's highly involved in producing speech, and it's located in the frontal lobe. And this is going to get very important in chapter 5, to make sure you just know that it exists. Then there's the motor cortex. So the motor cortex is basically like a map. It has a map of all of your body on this mapped out. And what it does is it basically initiates movements here. We'll get more into the motor system because I know I said the cerebellum manages motor functions as well, and so does the motor cortex. It's all a system that we'll go over when we get to chapter 3, and it's a very important system which you need to understand very carefully. So for now, just know that the motor cortex has a role in initiating movements and has a map of the body over it. So the function of the frontal lobe, as we've seen, is motor functions and definitely working memory. And it's also for planning, problem solving, personality, speech, memory, and voluntary movement. All right, so let's move on to the parietal lobe. So the parietal lobe is mostly known for spatial information, right? It processes a few senses, but for the most part, it processes spatial orientation. Let's get more into that. So first, let's go over some brief anatomy. The first is postcentral gyrus, which is also known as the somatosensory cortex. Then there's the superior parietal lobule and the inferior parietal lobule. So what these do, they supplement these functions and they record spatial location, so on and so forth, right? So the somatosensory cortex is very similar to the motor cortex. And in fact, they interact a lot, right? There's a lot of cross communication from these because when an object is slipping out of your hand, right? The way our reflexes work is due to a rapid communication between movement and touch. And it starts from the spinal cord and goes up. We'll go more into that in later chapters, but just know that there's very rapid communication between these two. And there's also a map of limbs on the postcentral gyrus. So what it does is any input will go to the corresponding region on the somatosensory cortex. So the function is obviously touch. It processes taste as well, and it processes a very special feature called proprioception, which is basically analyzing where an object is in space, and it also can process some visual information. And we'll get more into that in the next video. So then here's the occipital lobe, right? This occipital lobe is one of my favorite lobes, actually. So first, let's go over some brief anatomy. First one is the cuneus, which is basically the first half. So when you take a sagittal view of the brain, what you'll see is a small sulcus called the callicrine fissure or callicrine sulcus, which splits the occipital lobe into two parts, the cuneus and the lingual gyrus. So, and then there's the intraparietal occipital sulcus. So we saw in the previous slide that the parietal lobe is right next to the occipital lobe, right? So right about here, there's a small sulcus that separates them two, which is important, which is a really important landmark to identify which one is the occipital lobe and parietal lobe. But just remember that the occipital lobe is actually much smaller than what you've expected to be. So try to look for the sulcus around a little bit closer to the back of the brain. So let's just get a little bit more detailed into this about what it does. So V1, which is, so the occipital lobe is split into a few different sections, right? So the first one is V1, which is also known as the primary visual cortex. So when light first enters the eyes, obviously the brain breaks it down into different layers, right? And the most bare thing, it strips it down to lines, right? So what V1 does is it identifies the orientation of the lines. So say my table, it's flat, right? It's 180 degrees and it's horizontal. What the V1 will do is it'll understand, it will activate certain neurons corresponding to the flat line, so on and so forth. That's V1. And say there's something that's up at a 45-degree angle. The V1 will neurons in V1 that correspond to the 45-degree angle will activate when it sees a 45-degree angle object, right? Then there's V2, which is the secondary visual cortex. It supplements V1, it helps it, and it does a few more extra things. That function isn't very clearly known. Then V4 is known for color processing, right? So it identifies aspects of colors. Then V5 it's kind of part of the occipital lobe. It's somewhere closer into the temporal lobe as well. And basically what it does is it identifies objects in movement and where they are in space. So now let's move on to the subcortical regions. So as you can see here, this is a very good illustration of some of the core structures. While we're going to go over all of these items that are highlighted, for this one, in future videos, for this one, we're going to go over some basic structures, and we're going to focus on a system called the limbic system, which regulates our motivation, emotions, and really a lot of our social world, right? So these are also called the deep brain structures because they're located deep inside the brain. So the first one is the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is a seahorse-shaped structure, which is responsible for encoding new memories, right? So it's located in the temporal lobe, which we did not go over. So the temporal lobe, let's quickly go over that, is this piece over here. So there's the superior temporal gyrus, middle temporal gyrus, and the inferior temporal gyrus. And basically, the function of the temporal lobe is memory, encoding new memories, and auditory processing. So whenever there's information coming from the ear, the primary auditory cortex is in the temporal lobe. And we know that it also has implications in motivation, and it has implications in emotion, which we'll get more into later on. So now that we've gone over the temporal lobe, let's go over the amygdala. So as you can see here, this picture is actually really helpful because this is the amygdala, this red structure right here, and this whole piece is called the amygdaloid complex. The most simple definition of the amygdala is processing emotions. So whenever you feel happy or sad, so basically there is a scientist who defined 6 main emotions, which was fear, anger, joy, surprise, disgust, and sadness, right? So of these 6 emotions, amygdala processes them, and it's also responsible for the flight or fight response, where basically when the body is under stress, your body can either run away or it can fight the situation, and the amygdala is responsible for that. So it's a very crucial element. Another element is the thalamus. So the thalamus, you'll hear this word a ton, right? So you really need to know what this does. So as you can see here, we have a sagittal view or a half view of the brain. You can see this blue structure highlighted here, which is the thalamus. And most simply put, It is the switchboard of the brain. So when you get sensory information from any part of your body, right? Whether it be your hands, your eyes, and your ears, and your mouth, but actually not your nose. I'll explain that in the second video. It basically, they all come up to the thalamus and then get relayed to their specific parts of the brain. So let's say I got visual input, right? So let's say my eyes are right about here. And this is my optic nerve, right? Feeding into the thalamus. And once it feeds into the thalamus has projections that will relay it back to the occipital nerve. It's the same thing for the ear. Say that my auditory nerve feeds into the thalamus. Well, it doesn't directly feed into it. There's some neural projections that we'll get into later, which feeds into the thalamus, which will then relay it to the temporal lobes. So the thalamus basically receives sensory information, processes it, and sends it to the correct information. And it's not just a one-way thing, right? There are things called thalamocortical loops, which basically means that when the temporal lobe is done processing information, it's going to send it back to the thalamus, which will relay it back to whatever part of the brain that needs it. So let's put this into context, right? Say I hear my grandmother calling me from a distance. So let's draw this out, right? Say this is me, and I hear someone calling me. So say my grandma is saying, come here, right? I hear it. And so what it's going to do is it's going to come in from my ear. Then it's going to go to my thalamus. It's going to go to the thalamus. Let's actually draw it here. And then it's going to relay to the temporal lobe. After the temporal lobe processes it and identifies what is being heard, what am I hearing, how am I hearing it, and the temporal lobe only doesn't do this, it communicates with other regions of the brain as well. And once something has been done, so say I need to make a decision. I know what she's saying now. I know she's saying to come for dinner, but I'm in the middle of watching my favorite show. I'm in the middle of watching Stranger Things, and I really don't want to go, right? So it's going to go to my frontal lobe, and it's going to communicate there. It's going to say, oh, now it's got my prefrontal cortex is going to make a decision. It's going to say, oh, I want to go or I don't want to go, which is going to be relayed to my Broca's area to produce speech, which is going to be relayed to my thalamus, back again, and then relayed to my mouth and to produce actual speech coming out of my mouth. That's a really horrible diagram, but I hope you kind of got the flow of what I'm trying to say. I'll explain this more in the second chapter because it's a little bit more easier once you know the anatomy of it, but this is the gist of it. So then there comes the hypothalamus. So quite literally, as similar to the amygdala, what the hypothalamus does is it maintains homeostasis, right? So I'm sure you've heard of the word homeostasis before. It's basically the energy balance of the body, right? So when I'm consuming energy, so say I have hunger, I have reward, I have all of these things. These are the basic functions of life. And say I need to maintain my immune system. And I need to maintain the chemical balance of my body. Hypothalamus is very much responsible for that. And it also controls hormones that are emitted. So, for example, if I'm under very stressful situations, signals from the hypothalamus will release the stress hormone cortisol, which is released from the pituitary gland, right? So, if this is the thalamus, then the region right underneath it is the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is again crucial for hunger, thirst, and it's crucial for other stressful situations, releasing hormones, so on and so forth. Then the pituitary gland is what actually releases the hormones. The hypothalamus sends signals to the pituitary gland. So it sends signals, and then only the pituitary releases hormones to the body. So those are the basics of the brain. This is the very, very basics, and there's more to come. but this is just to give you a brief gist of what the brain is all about, and just to introduce you. And I introduced a lot of new things just to get you guys kind of intrigued, but we'll go more into detail and more organized and in-depth matter in future videos. Thank you so much for watching, and bye.